Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 161, Poor Naked Wretches, a conversation with Stephen Unwin. In today's guest episode, I'll be discussing Shakespeare's characterisations of the lower classes and looking at the role that they play with Stephen Unwin, whose book, Poor Naked Wretches, explores the variety of working people in Shakespeare's plays, as well as a vast range of cultural sources from which they are drawn, where he argues that the robust realism of these characters makes them so much more than just mere comic relief. Stephen Unwin is an award-winning British theatre and opera director. He has directed almost 100 professional performances and worked with many well-established actors and singers, as well as developing the careers of many younger ones. He studied at the University of Cambridge. In the 1980s, Stephen worked at the Almeida Theatre in London and the Traverse in Edinburgh, in repertoire theatre and at the National Theatre Studio. In 1993, he founded the English Touring Theatre, for whom he directed more than 30 productions of classical and new plays, many of which transferred to London. In 2008, he became artistic director of the New Rose Theatre in Kingston, which he ran until January 2014. He's worked extensively at the Theatre Royal Bath and has directed more than 20 operas. 10 of his productions have been seen in the West End. Stephen has taught in conservatoires and universities in Britain and America and written 10 books on theatre and drama, including Poor Naked Wretches. He has also written 5 original plays. All Our Children was premiered at the Jermyn Street Theatre in London in 2017 and staged in New York in 2019. And Laughing Boy opened at the Jermyn Street in 2024 and also played the Theatre Royal in Bath. Stephen is a campaigner for the rights and dignities of learning disabled people, and Beautiful Lives, How We Got Learning Disabilities So Wrong, is published by Wildfire Books in June 2025. And this is only a shortened version of Stephen's achievements, and I would encourage you to visit his website for much more information. You can find him at www.stephenunwin.uk, and I've put a link to that in the show notes. I spoke to Stephen over Zoom. In your book, you set out to examine the roles of working people in Shakespeare's plays, and, as you mentioned quite early on in the book, it's a question that comes out of your practical experience of directing productions of Shakespeare, and in particular a production of The Comedy of Errors. So perhaps we could start if you could tell us something about why that play in particular was so significant to your thinking.
Well, yes, it is. The book is about, it starts with the provocative question, was Shakespeare a snob? And as we'll discuss, it shows that I don't think he was a snob, and that I think that certain attitudes are certain understandings of Shakespeare are not quite accurate. It's not that The Comedy of Errors as such as a play was important. It was a moment as a student rehearsing, we happened to be rehearsing The Comedy of Errors, and I had one of those kind of, youthful moments of realization, which has never quite left me. Let me try and explain it. I think when you're a director, one of the things you're trying to do is trying to work out who the audience should look at and trying to encourage the audience to look at, have a focus on stage. And that's certainly what I used to think. And we were doing The Comedy of Errors. We were doing the scene when Antipholus is coming back with the goldsmith, and they find that the front door is locked and he can't get in. And I was sort of saying to myself, well, what's the audience looking at? What matters in this scene? What do I have to highlight, and whatever the opposite of highlight is? And then I suddenly realised that the point was a composition with contradictory figures and contradictory perspectives, and it's a bit like Bruegel. If you know that famous painting of the death of Icarus, the fall of Icarus, I beg its pardon.
Yeah.
You have the ploughman minding his own business doing the ploughing while this great world historical event is going on. In fact, this is what W.H. Auden famously said about the great masters were never wrong, because it's this counterpointing of different kinds of experiences and perspectives. And so what I realized in that moment, and then, and loads of other people have understood this before me. I'm not pretending this is kind of, dazzlingly new. But what I kind of got this very, very clear sense of is a dialectical playwright with counterpointed perspectives, and that everybody on stage is as interesting as the other one. And that so Antipholus returning in his pomp to give the goldsmith, isn't it? To give him a good lunch, hits up against kind of stubborn reality, the crooked timbers of humanity. Hits up against stubborn reality, which is the person who he thinks the door is shut and there's somebody in there who's pretending to be his slave, and his kitchen cook is the cook is there, and they are saying, "What are you doing here? Who are you?" And so they are blocking his entry. So what happens on stage is you get the full perspective, and you get the full class perspective, and that's the really critical point, is you get the view from the bottom as well as the view from the top. And the view from the top is not more important than the view from the bottom. They're all held in contradistinction with each other. And so that just became very clear at that moment. And then I think, after students end up in the pub chattering away about everything. And I think I was sharing this, and somebody said, yes, there's no hierarchy of reality on the Elizabethan stage. There's nothing one thing is more important than the other. And it's a very obvious point, but it's a very profound point. And then when you start staging it, you look at the servants, the peasants, the prostitutes, the farmers, the common soldiers, these full range of characters. And you start saying, well, what does he want? What does he think? What's his perspective on what his or her quote unquote betters are doing? What is their perspective? And then you start realizing that their perspective is fundamental to the drama, and fundamental to what one can sense of the dramatic meaning. So that's really what that little moment hit me at. And while I was at Cambridge, I had the great good fortune to be taught by Margot Heinemann, who was actually a communist, and she lectured on Shakespeare and Brecht. And in fact, I've just written a book about Shakespeare and Brecht. And she helped me kind of understand that insight in much more detail about how these characters had their own dignity, their own perspective, their own. So 40 years later, I have to tell you that over the last 40 years, I've directed quite a lot of Shakespeare plays, lots of other things as well. And I'd sort of done notes on this stuff and work on it and thought about it. So this book has taken sort of 40 years to come to fruition. Endless earlier drafts and so on. And then finally there we are. And I'm very, very proud of it. But it does go back to, I'm 65 now. It does go back to a moment when I was 21 in some strange way.
Interesting that it comes out of one of the early comedies as well.
Well, yes.
That suggests that, it was always, we'd say, in Shakespeare's mind, the stage could be democratic within a society that was patently not democratic and was very structured.
Yes. I use that word democratic slightly loosely because it's, of course, it's democratic. Yeah. But what it is, well, of course, within the Christian conception of the humble, and that the mighty pass, and that there's there are these other human values in the stable, not in the palace. That kind of Christian topsy-turvy, which is then also in the medieval tradition. It's back in the second Shepherd's play. The shepherds in the Second Shepherd's in the York cycle, are absolutely full and rich with vivid life. And you could say that right at the heart of those great medieval plays is the working man's experience. Another important figure in my development was the great director Peter Gill, who came is kind of one of his most famous moments was doing the Lawrence plays at the Royal Court, which were about working class experience. And he loved saying, I worked with him a bit, and he was sort of one of my kind of mentors for a while. And I remember him once saying, as a provocative joke, but as a good joke, he said, without the York realist playwright, the anonymous playwright of the York play, Shakespeare would have been a second-rate playwright like Goethe. Which I think is a terrific, fascinating provocation. And it was he said that to me just at the moment when I was getting very interested in Goethe and the German Romantic tradition. So there you go.
There's a lot to unpack there in that statement.
There's a lot to unpack in that. There's a lot, and this stuff goes off in every direction. The early plays, yes. Well, they come out of the popular tradition, and that book, Robert Weiman's Shakespeare and the Popular Tradition of the Theatre, is one of the important kinds of threads that run through this book. And the popular tradition, which means that you have a genuinely diverse, socially diverse audience. And so the servant standing on the front of the stage, talking to the audience, getting their support for their perspective on their demanding and absurd masters, runs right through the Comedy of Errors. That's how the Dromios work. Is that they say that the Dromio who says, I'm like a football. I can't remember the exact lines. He says, I've been kicked around.
Yeah.
He's appealing to the popular audience to take his side against his difficult and irrational masters. And that, as I understand it, has got its roots, in lots of things. It's actually got its roots in the Roman theatre, as well as the Commedia dell'arte, which of course is connected, but also, as I say, within the biblical tradition. So it's very, very hardwired. It's not. Do you know what I mean? I don't think I'm having to twist these plays to make this argument at all. My point is, I think you just have to read them carefully, and this stuff comes roaring off the page, off the stage. I think there's a critical point, which you can see in the early plays, but runs right through really, which is that quite often these characters have a sense of humour, but it's not that the audience is expected to laugh at them. It's that the audience laughs with them. But it's also, how do you get through a bad day? Gallows humour, through jokes. That's entirely human, that a guy doing a hard day's work, a really difficult, hard and boring and uncomfortable and badly paid job, will joke about it, joke about his life. But that doesn't mean that Shakespeare is laughing at. I think there's a more complicated question, which is those characters who are socially mobile going up, where you wonder whether Shakespeare is laughing at them. But that's a slightly different. Different.
Yeah.
But certainly the people at the bottom.
It's a sympathetic laugh.
It's a sympathetic perspective. Now, there are so many different caveats, to draw in this argument. One of which is that, there were all kinds of work, of manual labour that Shakespeare doesn't include. So, there's nobody in. I mean, there was an industry, there was mining, there was all kinds of industrial things going on in Elizabethan England. He doesn't include that, and only very rarely does he really deal with the poor naked wretches, the starving, the indigent, the vagabonds, the real real bottom of society. He tends to be writing about people who do jobs, if you like, who've got jobs. So it's not entirely comprehensive, but then why should it be? It's not social document. It's not documentary theatre, if you know what I mean. But it is surprising and striking once you start looking at it, just how much there is, which isn't kings and princes and noblemen and haute bourgeois. There's an awful lot of it.
Yeah, and that's, as you point out in the book, that's particularly true, or is true in many of the plays, but The Taming of the Shrew, Romeo and Juliet, earlier plays tend to have a lot of these characters in them who have a really significant part to play in the plot.
A really significant part to play in the plot, really, and not just. One of the things that I think is important is that they're not just, and the same, of course, happens in the early history plays. They don't just have an instrumental role to deliver a message, or they don't just do a job for the drama to work. They have opinions. They offer opinions. They offer perspectives on what's happening, and I think that's critical. So they have some agency. They have a dynamic relationship to what happens. Jumping right to one of the great plays, the messenger who brings Cleopatra the news that Antony is married, goes through a whole huge experience of being berated, being attacked, being seduced, being paid, being thrown out, and so through the way that he is treated, we understand something about Cleopatra. And there's a kind of a really fundamental thing in the theatre is, how do you show power? Well, really, you can't show power by acting power. You show power by the way that you're treated by other people. And so what Shakespeare does is he does that, and then we see the way that the other people think about him. They're not just mute. They're not simply servants, stage servants. And I think that is peculiarly, I mean, all good dramatists do a version of that, a lot of them imitating Shakespeare, but it is peculiarly fertile in this playwright.
So does that tell us something about the theatre of his time, or would you still see him as unique in that?
Looking at Christopher Marlowe, you have some of that, but not to the same extent. I think it shows something about the sort of humanistic basis of the writing. Well, and the biblical and the biblical basis, actually. I think there's something about all the world as a stage, that there's a determination, an ambition, and a kind of sensibility to include as many different perspectives on that stage as I can possibly get away with. And John Webster and Ford and those guys, Middleton, for all their genius, it doesn't have that same counterpointed genius. I think it's the nature of the counterpointing, which is what makes it so, for me, makes it so startling. And the way that everything that is shown is relative to something else, which to me is a perfect image of life. There's an interesting thing about the early plays. So, Romeo and Juliet is quite an early play. I did a workshop years and years and years ago with, I think I got about 15 or 20 working class actors together. And we spent 2 weeks just reading endless material, endless of these scenes, which is where some of my early notes came from. And so which play in Shakespeare has got, I think, I seem to sense most lines that could be described as from the perspective of the bottom, is that great romantic jewel, Romeo and Juliet. So that there's your perfect counterpoint, you see. The jewel of romantic love amongst the, well, what are they? The citizens, the urban nobility, whatever that is, exactly how that class is described. That drama is counterpointed by, the illiterate Peter, by the garrulous nurse, by musicians who Shakespeare shows want to earn a living and get fed up when their wedding is cancelled. They're not going to get paid. By those guys at the beginning who kind of get involved in the fight at the opening. You could even say that the friar, who, although of course he's got an education, he's a Franciscan, he's a barefooted friar. He is absolutely the call of poverty. Yes. is what it's about. So kind of wherever you look in that play, there is the earth, if you like. There's the earth in counterpoint to the beauty. I mean, I was teaching some actresses the other day, and somebody did a bit of that great speech in Romeo and Juliet by the nurse, where she says, well, it becomes clear that her daughter Susan was the same age as Juliet. So she, the nurse, breastfed her daughter Susan and Juliet. And then she says, it's so beautiful. She says, well, Susan is with God. She was too good for me. So what you get there is you get, right back there, you get the difference in life chances between Juliet, who's the daughter of the wealthy, and Susan, who's the daughter of a working woman whose husband has died as well, by the way. You get. So why does Shakespeare want to give so much detail? What does that do? Well, I think it helps you see Juliet more precisely as a figure from a particular time and place and world and class. And it also gives us points of empathy with the nurse, who we both like and are worried about. But I mean, it's a kind of, it's things like that which appear wherever you look when you attend to detail, which kind of are dazzlingly beautiful, I think, as kind of as stuff about the realities of human life. So at one point, Poor Naked Wretches, or a much earlier draft, I was sort of talking about Shakespeare's realism, which I think this is part of the realism. It's an aspect of it. It's not the full. That's another 5 volumes to do that.
So I'm interested to know what you think about the character of Jack Cade from Henry VI Part 2. Because he's in the context of a rebellion in the country. And do you think that tells us something about an attitude that Shakespeare had towards rebels and the lower classes? Or is he such a unique character that actually you can't extrapolate from him?
Well, no, I think Jack Cade is a really important test case of my argument, okay? And of course it goes, he's quite a big character, goes through several scenes. Look, what I think is that Shakespeare, the realist, says there is such a thing as rebellion from the ground up. There's the Peasants' Rebellion. The Peasants' Rebellion was enormous. There is such a thing as rebellion from the ground up, popular rebellion. Put it in modern terms, the Brexit vote. Right? It's very, very different. I'm not saying it's the same, and you can say with all of those kinds of rebellious moments, which of course, unlike the Brexit vote, which kind of are also violent, that they are both heroic and justified, and at times questionable. It seems to me that the danger is to imagine that anything is one thing or another. And there are moments in Jack Cade when you go, yeah, absolutely. And then there are other moments when you think, hang on, he's a sort of vain self-publicist.
Mm.
Well, isn't it possible that he's both? And then there are moments when suddenly you see him being violent, but then you realise that what's the violence that's going to be meted out to him? So the violence that's coming from the ruling class is going to be even more violent than anything that he's proposing. So, should we be saying, well, is Clifford just a monster? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's a kind of it's magnificent stuff. Well, I'm going to just read 2 paragraphs. Jack Cade's rebellion in Henry VI Part 2 is an important case in point. This episode, it is often claimed, demonstrates that Shakespeare regarded class consciousness, let alone rebellion, with suspicion, if not downright contempt. Even the great Danish progressive Georg Brandes claimed that its wild communistic enthusiasm shows in Shakespeare a detestation of the mob, while Romain Rolland, that robust French champion of a people's theatre, maintained that, quote, no satire is sharper of popular revolution than Cade's uprising. More recently, the distinguished critic Walter Cohen insisted that Shakespeare presents the rebel's position in the serene confidence that it will be contemptuously dismissed, while the scholar William Carroll argued that Cade is demonized so as to invalidate or at least qualify his claims of social injustice. Now, those are all the serious negative.
Yeah.
In coming to our own view, however, we should start with the historical record. Popular uprisings were more common than conservative propagandists would like us to think, and violent rebellion and its equally violent suppression was a fact of life. The peasants' revolt was the greatest of all and threatened the entire political order, which, quote, had always lived in fear of social revolution, and in 1381 peered into the abyss. But there were dozens of others, most recently the large-scale Kett's Rebellion of 1549. Cade's rebellion of 1450 was smaller than either, better disciplined, and the forces more urban, but it managed to seize the city, sack the Inns of Court, and threaten the status quo. Blah, 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 blah. And then I go into it in much more detail. But what I'm trying to say is that this is more like a realistic or kind of a report of an event, a journalistic report of an event.
Right.
Than a simplistic, moralizing drama. There's a fascinating moment when he dies. Shakespeare goes out of his way to make us feel sympathetic for it because he's starving, he's hungry, and he is killed by a great big beefy knight in Kent who basically says that might is right and that this chap is quite right that we kill him. So I think that Shakespeare with a popular audience says, but hang on, this guy, just because this guy is not, in the member of the gentry or the aristocracy, he's still a human being with human value. So, yeah, I think that'd be my big argument about Cade, and there are about 20 pages in there about Cade. It's big. But I think it's multi-dimensional. That's what I think. And that's brilliant. And that's true to life.
Yes, and it leaves us with many questions hanging rather than answers.
Well, with questions hanging and different perspectives. You also see, by the way, that he's been manipulated by York, by the aristocrat. Shakespeare touches of realism all the time. It's like Susan is with God. There's so many touches of realism which make you look at it in more nuanced way. I think that we are still sort of dealing with in Shakespeare production and Shakespeare thinking. I think in some strange way we're still dealing with the consequences of sort of the Leavisite moralistic teachings of the sort of 1940s and 1950s, and that the reaction against that has all been about gender and race and sexuality to an extent. But what's sort of been forgotten is this class element, which is not simply as sort of monarchist or aristocratic as Tilliard, etc., have argued. I mean, I found if you go back to some of the romantic critics, I mean, particularly Hazlitt is fantastic. William Hazlitt is fantastic about a lot of this stuff. And even if you look at Coleridge, who in a way is a Tory, but even when you look at Coleridge, you see that he's attending to it with more social detail, attention to social nuance than quite a lot of modern practice. So I think the book is a bit countercultural at the moment.
So just to finish up with, I wanted to move on to the chapter where you deal with murderers, thieves, outlaws and con men.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, they are morally dubious characters, but they're used for comic and sometimes ironic effects in the play. Scenes that make us feel uncomfortable and laugh at the same time. So thinking about people like the murderers of Clarence and Richard III, I mean, that combination, does that actually make them some of Shakespeare's greatest creations? The fact that they can have that effect on us.
The murderers there are those two murderers are absolutely fantastic. And Shakespeare goes out of his way to show that they are, first of all, that they are simply trying to do what they're instructed to do. Okay, they're poor men who need to earn a living. Why does Shakespeare show that? He shows that because that's true. They show no relish in murdering Clarence. If anything, they're very, very reluctant. One of them more reluctant than the other. There's a whole set of prohibitions, thou shalt not kill, is hardwired into them, and what is my conscience and everything. And, I think they are, they're written, it's a very long scene, by the way. Shakespeare goes out of his way. He could just have, let's have Clarence killed. Boom. It could have been he didn't have to write that scene. So what he's doing, I think, is he's showing that the decisions of the mighty have to be delivered by real people, by real people dealing with real things. I mean, there was something came up the other day, as war is fought by young men who have no desire to kill each other, but they have to kill each other under the instructions of old men who will not get killed, but for some reason want the other person to be killed. You know what I mean? It's a sort of madness. So, I mean, I think that applies to Shakespeare's soldiers a lot of the time, is that he writes them as human beings put into dreadful moments where they're being expected to do something which is deeply unnatural. I mean, I think there's a kind of a thing in the theatre which is to make these guys all sort of macho. I don't think that's right at all. I don't think it is it's not Top Gun. It couldn't be further from Top Gun. It's poor men sort of having to earn a living by doing things that they shouldn't really do. And they end up asking for forgiveness from God, because it's wrong. But he just all the time with the murderers, as I say, as with the soldiers, I can't think of a single example where he shows a murderer, a professional murderer, doing it with relish. Possibly the murders of Lady Macduff and the kids. He's possibly got a bit of that. There's something so terrifying. What are these faces, But even that is just grim, grim. I mean, the parallel thing actually is the sex trade. At no point is he prurient about that. No point do you think that he's getting off on it. Forgive me. He's drawing it as this kind of ghastly thing that poor women sometimes have to do in order to survive. which again it's all governed by this realistic attitude to life, anti-idealistic, the opposite of idealism. I mean, one of my very favourite lines in Shakespeare is Rosalind. Men have died from time to time and worms have eaten them, but not for love. And I love that because it's so skeptical. And I suppose that's what this stuff is kind of talking about, is skeptical, human, ordinary, what Kant called the crooked timbers of humanity. I think that's what he's doing. And it can't be souped up. There's a funny thing in the modern theatre is because of finances and everything, these parts are often shrunk or cut or just ignored, just sort of hardly staged, or turned into comic relief. And comic relief is a completely un-Shakespearean concept, I'm convinced. So that's what I mean about, I think it's a little bit what I'm trying to do is I think a bit countercultural, but I think the book is, I go out of my way to root it in the text, in quotations, and it's I think it's evidenced, I hope. So I thought it might be nice just to read the last 2 paragraphs of the book, which gives some flavour of what I'm trying to say. It has been suggested with some reason that the double shock of the Brexit vote in Britain and the election of Donald Trump in the United States was only possible because, quote, the liberal elite ignored the views of working people and took for granted the compliance of the left behind, with the journalist Owen Jones wondering how hatred of working people had become so acceptable. We should ask the same question of Shakespeare and make sure we don't fall into a similar trap. The ongoing multiple crises of our times certainly deserve something more than snobbery. For, as the visionary Russian film director Grigory Kozintsev reminded us, what really matters is not Edgar pretending to be a beggar in King Lear in order to hide from his pursuers, but poverty itself, the bitter village woe, which howls, laments, treads the earth's surface with nowhere to shelter, no strength to endure. Poverty is real and cannot and should not be ignored. And in a time when a series of economic, social and health crises has dramatically widened the gap between rich and poor, where human worth is increasingly measured by productivity, and when politicians, the progressive media and popular culture all too often place the blame for poverty on the poor and themselves, it is alarmingly relevant. In 1964, the civil rights activist, playwright and author James Baldwin wrote that the greatest poet in the English language found his poetry where poetry is found, in the lives of the people. More than 70 years before, the young Romain Rolland spoke of Shakespeare's common pity as being a bridge thrown across the moat which separates individuals and classes, joining the hands of the rich and the poor, the masters and the servants. If the peril of traditional criticism is that it normalizes the lives of the rich and powerful and drains class difference of meaning, such a bridge offers a more inclusive and humane image of both art and society. It is high time that Shakespeare's working people were recognised as central to his achievement and counted among the guarantees of his enduring status as the world's indispensable dramatist.
My thanks for Stephen for his time and sharing some of his thoughts with us. Poor Naked Wretches is published by Reactian Books, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes of this episode. As I'm sure you've gathered, it is a detailed and thoughtful examination of Shakespearean characters who have usually been more overlooked. I certainly found it a great help when I was trying to get a holistic view of the plays I've covered so far, and I'm sure I will be keeping it close at hand in the future. Next time, there will be more on, as Stephen put it, that great romantic duel, Romeo and Juliet. But in the meantime, if you've not done so already, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or Blue Sky, just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com.